Hello and welcome to the Tolkien Society. I am your host and founder, Hawk Robinson. We meet monthly on the third Saturday of each month from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Time and discuss all things Tolkien and Tolkien adjacent generally. Today is November 16th, 2019. We have people joining both remotely and here in the studio in Spokane, Washington. We are an official Smile of the UK Tolkien Society, so an official chapter.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear, hear. May the hair on his toes never fall out. So if you want to go ahead and each take a turn.
Hi, I'm Brian. I'm the secretary of this erstwhile group.
Hi, I'm Chris Cooperstein, dues paying member.
Hi, Mom. I'm a guest. I'm Noah.
And joining us remotely, walking all over, giving everybody motion sickness and seizures.
Making hot sick by walking around.
You going to settle down at some point here?
Okay. Introduce yourself. Friend or foe?
I'm John Welker. I run games at Tolkien Moot.
Welcome. And we are post Tolkien Moot 15. We had 15 years of moots. Once a year. Yeah. And it was our first stage campaign. Before that, we had done second and third and fourth age, but our first stage. Yeah. Now we'll be going back into the second age, it sounds like, based on the vote. So, without further ado, because we've been doing a lot, let's go ahead and jump into the meeting notes from the last meeting, which was the moot. Mind if you take that
Absolutely.
away?
Sure thing. Let me just and Hawk, as far as people listening in, is it we have a YouTube channel right now, or is it
We
just
do,
through
yeah.
Jitsi?
It's youtube.com/Tolkien Scholars, and they can join the conversation at meet, MEET, JIT.SI/Tolkien.
Because I was thinking I could just send a message to Sam if you want.
Sure,
to.
yeah, please.
So
And in the future, we can actually, now that we have Jitsi working on our own servers, we'll actually be able to do things like host and embed streaming straight from our website without having to use YouTube as an intermediary. Especially with YouTube and Twitch and everybody else ratcheting up the commercialism of it and making it harder for small streams to survive.
okay, could you please repeat the Jitsi the meetup?
Yeah, meet, MEET, JIT.SI/Tolkien.
And if you have the Jitsi app,
You can do it on your
write in the
phone
word
as well.
Tolkien, and
But
you'll
from a
come
lap-
straight here.
Okay, so John, from a laptop though, will the meet.jit.si work fine?
/Tolkien, yes.
/Tolkien. Okay.
Yes. That's what this is right here.
That's not it.
Okay, so just one moment and I'll start. And you said it's also it's watchable on.
YouTube.com/Tolkien Scholars.
Right.
You know, there'll be a little bit of latency, but it will be just fine.
Okay, I'm almost ready. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
I will.
And so, Chris, you're up here from Tri-Cities. I'm so glad you make the journey. It's several hours drive. I'm glad you are able to make the time to do that. We're always happy to see you here in person. It's very nice.
And when I don't, I'll show up
Remotely?
Jitsi
Excellent.
potentially.
Yeah, in the future we'll have something where you can actually we won't be using the public server forever, but for now.
Okay. I think
All right.
we're about ready
So
here.
go ahead with the meeting notes from the last meeting then, Brian.
Very good. All right, thanks, Hawk. All right, so at our October 19 Tolkien Society meeting, we had a guest speaker, Sam Gesh. This was during our annual Tolkien Moot. And so we had moved it from our typical meeting in July, third Saturday in July, to actually October, as our founder Hawk and his wife Katie were married in July. So it was really interesting to do it in October. It worked out really well, and we had our typical embedded Tolkien Society meeting in that. So here are the notes from that. We had a panel discussion, and so I introduced Sam, who's my brother-in-law, Sam Gesh. And before we got going into that, unfortunately, we had no notes from September 2019, although faithfully Chris Cooperstein did make sure it was filmed, and it is in the archives for those who want to go back and watch our September meeting, but there are no notes from that. So we went straight into kind of really just a panel discussion about the fall of Gondolin. May I? Or you want to hold that up there? So the fall of Gondolin as one of the three great stories of the elves that really captured
For John's
Tolkien's.
sake, you would do it to that camera over there. For John's sake.
This-
For
this-
Jitsi. Yeah.
So Tolkien's, involvement in and desire to tell these stories that were really kind of moving around in his mind and kind of coalescing into a number of stories, but three great stories, and one of them being the Fall of Gondolin. We discussed how World War I shaped J.R.R. Tolkien, so we touched on that again in light of kind of the theme for this year's Tolkien Moot, which had to do with the as it were, the fight to kind of protect Gondolin and kind of being sandwiched in between various wars of the First Age between Morgoth, who's the original baddie before Sauron. Sauron, of course, was there at that time, but this is, the one to whom Sauron was the lieutenant. And so Morgoth versus the elves and the noble elf friend humans at that time, and even dwarves. So kind of how therefore World War I shaped J.R.R. Tolkien, as wars do play a pretty big part in his legendarium. We talked about ambiguity versus allegory in Tolkien's works. The idea of, right, and in this case we brought it up because of how he leaves intentional loose ends. Part of the loose ends are because he just never stopped niggling. He was always working. It was a lifelong endeavor, but that there were actually intentional loose ends that he left that way because he didn't want to definitively say this is who Tom Bombadil is, or this is exactly that. And then we talked about Tolkien's point of view, how language makes story, which is just, again, very different from what we're used to thinking in our day.
Right.
Which is usually story makes language.
Right. Yeah.
And then this was really helpful actually. Why was Gondolin created? So we had a lot of back and forth, but this is the part where
experience because of the convention.
Exactly. And so and I think a lot of the players felt that it was helpful to get kind of the backdrop of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and then kind of before that, of course, that Gondolin was created as kind of this haven and this secret refuge for the Noldor and elves. And by the way, anybody can hop in on this and comment on it. But just talking about the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, we kind of covered the fact that this involved kind of these last stands of men, the three houses of men, the Edain, elves and dwarves. Not all of them perished, but these were pretty amazing. And then we talked about dragons without wings, not rings. Dragons without wings, such as Glaurung, and how dragons without wings preceded dragons with wings, like Calagon. Then
they hadn't grown their wings yet.
Right. Yeah, and then there were some.
They were really small.
There you go.
Like a lot of the drawings that Lewis has.
Yes. Or Chrysophylax, right?
Yes.
Unwinged worms.
Yes. And then we had additional comments on Gondolin and its importance, especially the survival of Eärendil, because without Eärendil, if Eärendil perishes, for example, right, just kind of putting out there kind of like a what if scenario, then how does that affect?
Things break?
Yes, exactly. So kind of the whole idea of
Morgoth wins.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really fascinating, kind of that whole kind of side of things. So Sam kind of walked us through some of that. We talked about it. We had various comments from the audience. We had concluding remarks, and then the next meeting of Tolkien Society shall be on Saturday, November 16. And then I will just read through, if you'd like me to right now, unless you want to wait.
No, go ahead.
The Tolkien Moot proposals and
Please.
votes. Okay. So then that was our Tolkien Society meeting from October. But then at the end of the night, after our third and final session of
those who stick around
of role playing through the, and we'll kind of touch on that and reflect on kind of what happened for Tolkien Moot. But after we role played through the Fall of Gondolin, then it was a question about Tolkien Moot for next year, which will be Tolkien Moot XVI, number 16. So here were the themes or ideas, suggestions, and their votes. Something based on an encounter centered around Tom Bombadil and Goldberry, 2 votes. Something more from the First Age, 4 votes. The Dwarves of the Blue Mountains or ruins of that area, or dwarvish archaeology. That's kind of hard to say, actually. Dwarvish archaeologist. 3 votes. 2 votes for that. And then Southron's 3 votes for the dwarvish 3, not 7 for the dwarf lords in the halls of stone. 3 for the dwarves, 2 for the Southrons or Easterlings, and for the idea of Numenor and recycling and repurposing and refreshing what has been done in the past, 8 votes. And then finally, dragons, 4 votes, winged or unwinged. So therefore, based on the overwhelming number there, the proposal then would be that next year's theme for Tolkien Moot in July is the rise of Numenor, the beginning of the Second Age, and incorporating other elements as possible that people would like to see, much as we did this last year with finding a quest for a sword of worth, along with the fall of Gondolin. So those are the notes from
Yep.
October.
So, and it'll be based on. So we played through it many years ago, back in 2007 or 8. It was called First Contacts, plural, and it's multiple snapshots of the rise of Numenor. So it's the first time they made contact with Middle Earth after being gone for hundreds of years, after they were given the Isle of Gift. They come back. Middle Earth is in darkness, overrun by Sauron and his creatures. You know, the elves are all hiding off in their little enclaves here and there, and here come these great giant men, you know, with technological advances of armor and military might and ships showing up on the shores for the first time, and these primitive huts of men who are living in terror and fear of the dark and the creatures roaming wild, running amok, and that first encounter with the primitive men. And then they leave gifts behind and teach some of the skills and things like that. Then some time goes by and we kind of jump into like the next generation of the next visit, because the first few visits were spread pretty far apart. And then slowly the Numenorians became a more and more regular thing. And eventually, as they're rising, they start stripping Middle Earth of resources. The Greenwood the Great and everything, they went up the Anduin and just started stripping all the forests for their great ships back in Numenor. They'd haul all the wood all the way back across the seas to build more and more of their great ships and other resources. And they basically started to kind of plunder Middle Earth much more. And they were growing in glory and power and might, until finally they get to the pinnacle with our Pharazôn the Golden, who usurps the throne, right, through a relative, marrying a relative, and yet they are also at their pinnacle of power.
Relatively common plot.
Yes, it is indeed. So much so that Sauron, they show up to fight Sauron, and Sauron just surrenders. His folks all flee, and he goes, "You got me. Just take me. I'm not even going to try to fight."
But he becomes the virus.
But yes, then he slowly wiggles his way, and he waits, and he's
Are
patient.
you saying that he is the original Worm Tongue?
certainly. That's, I don't know about original, but certainly, definitely. I mean, he was Anatar. He's Lord of Gifts still, right? This is before he lost his fair form. And he watched as our Pharazôn started to age. And the Numenorians by then had a huge both fear and worship of death. And so he bided his time and slowly over the years poisoned the Emperor's mind.
So that they even had a temple to worship.
Right.
Morgoth.
They eventually created a Morgothian temple and started
Human
burning
sacrifice.
the faithful
Yep.
alive in offering to Morgoth.
So kind of that whole arc.
That whole arc, you get the first part of it on the rise. Mm-hmm. So then the next year would be a Cullabeth, the fall of Numenor, right? And we may potentially break it up over several years. Any one of these could be a campaign unto itself. It depends on how deep you want to go with each one. The First Contacts one was originally written for the 3-day Tolkien moot, 3 and 4 day marathon. So in reality, what will probably happen is you'll have the first one, and each year, and it'll probably take about 5 years to go through, 5 or 6 years to go through the arc, till the fall of Numenor. And then there's one that's 1 year after the fall of Numenor, which starts in Umbar a year after the fall of Numenor. So a 5 or 6 year arc potentially here, where you really get an understanding of what led to Gondor and Eriador and the Dunedain and the Black Numenorians and all that. You will, if you go through this campaign, you will have a very in-depth understanding of that whole swath of time, spanning a couple thousand years.
Which I think...
And it's formative for
it
the
is.
future of Middle-earth for Third Age.
Yeah, just as we saw in the First Age, kind of the seeds that later on, far later in the Third Age, there's kind of echoes, as it were, of this epic fight between good and evil, and the unlikely people, is the small and seemingly insignificant that end up turning the tide. And we can see these hints in the First Age, but it's definitely even more clear in the Second Age, because then you start to have, here we have people who are going to be the direct ancestors of...
John, can you mute your phone when you're not speaking, please? Thank you.
So just that the way in which the Third Age becomes really growing out of the
there he
soil
is.
of the Second Age. Hey, Sam. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you.
Nanu, nanu, live long and prosper.
or just thaw, because I hear you're pretty cold right now.
And in the Middle Ages, this story is retold in the Ring Das Nibelungen.
Nibelungen, yes,
There's
indeed.
actually a great episode of Tolkien Society.
Well, multiple. We had
Yeah.
the California head of the
Wagner.
the Wagnerian Society
Yeah.
for California on our show a few times and
Those
sharing his maps and
graphics.
everything.
I
Yeah,
love those graphics.
and
That
those are
was
still on
fascinating.
the website. Those are still on the TolkienScholars.org website.
I
with
should
links
put
to
a link
it.
there.
Yes, yeah, they should be there. Hopefully, I mean, been through a few server moves over the years, but hopefully they're all there. And he goes into in depth. He created all these infographics of the story and all the locations on the map and everything of what happens in the Nibelungen.
And that's just helpful for learning the story, but then also to see interesting connections, not really inspirations so much, but just, I mean, would you say?
Oh, it's definitely intertwined. I mean, the Norse Edda and the Finnish Edda are
Common source
core
material.
part of Tolkien's material.
Yeah.
So therefore, Wagner also drawing on the
It's
similar.
the same source, yeah, same
Right.
source material. He spins it in a little bit different direction, but they all come from the Norse Edda and,
Well,
and
the
Tolkien
dwarf
brings in the
Mim,
Finnish Edda.
the dwarf Mim.
Right. Oh,
I'm thinking,
totally.
oh, wow.
Yes, it is directly. It looks like he's straight from.
Straight
I mean, the
from
name.
Wagner.
It's the same. It borrowed straight from it. So.
Except all the dwarves are like Mim.
Yes, well, and he's a petty dwarf, right? So.
Those petty dwarves. They're only up to petty larceny.
So it's quite significant, the overlap there,
Right.
And they're complementary. And speaking of the infographics, we're using one. So we have an electronic role playing game division, and we're working on training our developers on how to do these story based games and such. And we're using Shakespeare's The Tempest as the skeleton of the story we're going to be creating with these adventures.
What?
Yeah.
Cool.
What? I've not heard about this.
Oh yeah, we're working on it since August.
Yeah.
Got a whole software division now,
Shakespeare's The Tempest.
and we're doing Shakespeare's The Tempest. So first we're going to recreate the adventure in Neverwinter Nights to train it so you can play it through Neverwinter Nights, and then we're doing it with our own text-based role-playing game that we're developing, and then eventually be able to bolt on graphics and different game systems and stuff.
Wow.
So
So
it's
who thought of using Shakespeare?
me? We brainstormed a bunch of ideas. I just public domain. We wanted we're doing it all open source.
Yeah, I don't
you know.
think you're gonna have a problem with Shakespeare.
We're doing it all open source, and Tempest is a good. It's got magic, it's got spellcasters, it's got spirits, it's got the shipwrecked island. You've scattered the people. It's perfect for setting up a typical like D&D adventure type
I
situation.
never thought about that, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, no, we've gone through a full analysis of it.
So I'm kind of invested in The Tempest because it's based on a real life shipwreck
Yeah.
on the Bermuda Islands.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
My ancestor Stephen Hopkins was on
Oh,
a
really?
ship called the Sea Venture, and so most scholars would say that although William Strachey's account of this the tempest that they were involved in, and then their wreck,
Mm-hmm.
and then living on this Isle of Devils, which is what Bermuda's was really that the unpublished manuscript that William Strachey brought back from Jamestown to England would have been read by Shakespeare, who they had mutual friends who were investors in the Virginia Company. He didn't publish it till like 1619,
Okay.
and The Tempest I think was published in like 1612 or 1613.
Okay. But he would have seen.
But he would have
the early
seen it. That's
version,
the
right.
idea, because there's so many connections, and even
Okay.
some of the quotes out of it.
Nice.
And so Stefano, the drunken butler,
Yes, yes.
is directly based on my ancestor.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, well then you might want to be part of this project.
I
We'll always
might.
need play testers and stuff.
Oh,
too,
yes.
so
Count me in.
First we do it with Neverwinter Nights,
Right.
and then we do it with our own game system. This is just to teach our developers certain concepts. It's going to take us years to finish developing.
Well, yeah.
So
Interesting.
But
Wow.
yeah.
Okay, fascinating.
That's on Thursdays that we do that. Thursday nights, 6 to 8 p.m. We alternate between Neverwinter Nights training and developer meetings. So we just had our developer meeting this Thursday. Next week is Neverwinter Nights training. So you don't have to have a copy. If you want to come here, that's why we have these laptops here. They all have Neverwinter Nights pre-installed, and you can come and play it. We teach you how to play it.
What do you call it?
Neverwinter Nights. Or you can buy it for $20 for the base package, or it's $50-something for the bundle. It's a 17-year-old game that's going up in value. That's never happened that I've ever seen before, other than collector's items. A reissued new game
Yeah.
that's actually an old game It is the old game. They just tweaked it a little. And now it's Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, and now consoles.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Anyway.
Okay.
It's a total tangent, but the Tempest part was the key thing I wanted, and the infographic has really helped us with trying to figure out where the story goes, and those infographics will be helpful. And again, what was it, Bill, or I forget his name, but the
Can't
guy
remember.
from
the Wagner
the
Society.
Wagner Society, really great infographic that he shared and through the
I
site.
suppose if we
Find
want to
it
be
very
really
useful.
nerdy, we could,
And I'll see if I can find
your
it to
own
share
favorite
here.
Infographic, right?
Yeah. Participate in your crowdsource your own infographic.
Well, let's rein it back into Tolkien.
Yep.
And his works. So those were the notes, and thank you, Hawk, for kind of fleshing that out so we kind of understand the story arc and where that's going.
Marty. It was Marty Kirshen,
Marty Kirshen.
California Wagnerian Society. This was on June 13th, 2015. And the meeting notes are there.
Okay.
And,
We'll look later and
yeah.
see if we can find those infographics.
Yep.
So could we have just a brief kind of recap on Tolkien Moot? First of all, Sam, since you're online, I just read before you came on the kind of the notes from our meeting. Did anybody have a comment on those? I felt it was really helpful to have that kind of panel discussion.
Oh, yeah.
For the players, because a lot of people didn't have the depth of background on the first age that many people who like Tolkien's works would, because they're more familiar with the third age. Is
Right.
that what you would say?
Yeah, that's generally the case. Generally, most know The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, maybe parts of the Silmarillion, but generally it's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings that they know. And that's about it.
Noah, can I
And
just...
Peter Jackson's interpretation often.
Well, yes. When either of you, when you were reading and got involved in enjoying Tolkien, was it through the books or the movies initially?
It was through The Hobbit first,
Yep.
and then by the time I finished The Hobbit, I was old enough to watch the movies, and then I think I watched the first movie, and then
And we're assuming the Peter Jackson movies, not
Yeah.
the cartoons
Yeah.
or the rotoscope. Okay.
Oh.
Because we grew up watching the 70s and early
Yes.
80s ones.
So,
okay.
so then from the movies, then you watched the Fellowship of the Ring, and then did you get into the book?
I watched The Fellowship of the Ring, and then I thought that I could read The Two Towers and The Return of the King, and realized that was a huge mistake. So I actually read The Two Towers, The Return of the King, then went backwards and read The Fellowship of the Ring,
How
which
odd.
is a very unorthodox way
Wow.
of doing it.
That's so
Yeah.
interesting.
And then I watched the later two movies.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay,
Huh.
so
So it's probably quite jumbled in your head about how things
And I was in
happen.
4th grade when I read those.
Oh,
other
boy.
books, too,
Yeah.
so-
right.
Yeah.
So then later on, then would you say that you felt like before you ever read the Silmarillion,
Yeah.
that you kind of felt like I kind of know the third age a bit, like
At least the end of it.
the end of it there.
The
Last
2
50
paragraphs
years.
in the Silmarillion.
Because getting to know the Legendarium
Yeah.
is itself a journey. I
Yeah.
find.
Yes, it is.
Because it's like
An iterative one.
it's kind of like the making of a movie. It's that idea of where your knowledge of Middle Earth is also itself kind of a journey of how you come to know, because it's so immense. What about you, Chris?
I am currently reading chapter 3 of The Hobbit to my daughter.
How old?
7.
Nice.
She'll turn 8 in December.
Nice.
And my son, I suppose, when he's paying attention. Like most 7-year-old boys.
Sam, did you have any comments at all on the reading of kind of the people's background knowledge on the third age as opposed to the first age?
Not really.
Yeah,
Nothing comes to mind.
I feel like it adds a great deal.
John, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Because I think you might fit more of that demographic.
Well, I started with The Hobbit when I was young, and then watched the cartoon movies in the set back then. I'm currently trying again to get to the Silmarillion, however you pronounce it. Unfortunately, I have an audiobook that I can just keep rewinding and going, what were they talking
Yep.
about?
Yep.
Which one is that, John? Is that the public domain one?
The audiobook?
Yeah.
I
From
don't
the
know that
90s?
it's public domain or not.
There's one on the Internet Archive that's, I think, to 1998 that's quite good.
I would have to look it up. And
It's read by English, I think, Robert English or whatever. That's public domain now?
Yeah.
I didn't think that was public domain. I think it's de facto because it's proliferated. I don't think it actually is public domain.
Less than 100 years old, right?
Well, everything that's
I
Tolkien, the copyright got extended because of Mickey Mouse until 75 years after Tolkien's death.
It's all
It
Mickey's
was
fault.
35 years. It was going to be public domain in the end of the 90s. But because of Mickey Mouse and Congress and Clinton, they doubled it from 30.
The
Well,
trifecta!
he signed it.
The
He signed it
trifecta!
in. It took all of them to make it happen. They doubled it from 35 years to 75 years.
And
Something
it
like
would
that.
be just like this current administration to
Yeah.
thumb their nose and say, no longer.
Yeah. Well, it became in line with Europe's rules by then.
Yeah.
Which is
right.
planning to happen again. So Europe is once again planning to double or extend it again, and then they'll put pressure on the
Yeah,
U.S. to do it again.
that's not-
Because if you look at the copyright law in the '60s, how Ace Books did their whole pirated version,
Oh my
the
goodness.
horrible
Yeah,
was it
that's-
Ace or Tor? It was Ace, right? It was
Sam, do you know?
Yeah, it was Ace.
yeah. And they did that horrible pirated version. That was so bad. But it was rampant in the U.S. at the time because they weren't really doing the copyright enforcement so much. And so that's been something that's been an ongoing thing.
I mean, this is where I sit, I guess. On the outside, it should be public domain once Christopher dies plus 25 years.
Unfortunately, the way they changed the law.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there have been multiple articles ever since that law passed about the end of public
Yeah.
domain.
Yeah.
That there are things going to public domain that aren't popular, but the big stuff that has intellectual property rights, we may never see go public domain because they'll just keep extending it.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. And that affects our ability to do these things
Yeah,
with
I mean,
Tolkien.
trademarks are one thing, trade secrets are one thing.
Yeah.
But
When the author's dead and their
published
kids,
works and their kids,
how many generations?
That's it.
the estate of Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
C.S. Lewis, H.P. Lovecraft.
Yep.
H.P. Lovecraft's, though, they have their estate, but they've been very liberal
Uh-huh.
about what you can do an awful lot with H.P. Lovecraft stuff. It's quite flexible,
Yeah.
but it's a choice each estate makes.
All I know is I just hope that they never end up doing that whole casino gambling thing they were going to do based on Middle Earth. Did you ever hear about that one?
Maybe, and I may have blocked it
Yeah.
for fear of trauma.
It was one of the ideas that got axed. But anyway, on to great
Okay,
things.
great.
So, yeah. By the way, speaking about copyright, I just started. This is relevant here. I just finally got back to rereading The Lord of the Rings. It's been a while, and that's one of the things I would say post Jackson movies. I've enjoyed them so much, and I feel like one of the unfortunate side effects is that even being fairly well versed with Tolkien's work and the story of the Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
is that there are things that creep in that you just start to forget, and what you remember is what you've seen the most, right?
Mhm,
and you're
mhm.
more and more
It
familiar
gets
with
all
the movies.
distorted, yeah.
It does. So
Yep.
just really good getting back in and being able to read at a slower pace.
Mm-hmm.
And the introduction to the 50th anniversary edition from 2005, 2006. It's the one volume that I bought. I really, really enjoyed that because it talked about kind of all the different versions of, all the errors that crept in from printing and how Tolkien was trying to, make it sure that all of those were fixed. So that was kind of fascinating. But I am in chapter 1 and an unexpected party. So enjoying it very much. So, yeah.
Sam, did you have anything you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, topics. Anything Tolkien related?
We'd like everybody to be able to shape the conversation. Something you feel like you'd like to talk about.
Not off the top of my head. I'd almost forgotten about this, and then Brian texted me and said, "You can join if you want." And I was done grading, so.
Thank you for joining us.
Oh, pro problem. Off the top of my head, I don't have anything other than just what's bouncing around now from
Okay.
having listened to you guys talk for a while.
John?
Nothing specific. I'm interested in the Numenera.
You're really
What
muffled.
books?
You're really muffled, John.
The Numenera. Which books?
Numenor.
do I read?
Numenor. Numenera is
Numenor.
Monty Cook games,
Okay.
which they may have
think
borrowed from Numenor, but so the Numenorian stuff that's in the Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales and several of the History of Middle Earth. But as far as getting,
The Akalabeth.
yeah, the Akalabeth summarizes it in one short chapter about that, and then the Unfinished Tales has quite a bit more. And then some of the History of Middle Earth go into even more depth. But you would start generally with the Akalabeth, which is kind of the end of the Numenorians, but it's still foundational.
And that's kind of like in the middle of the Silmarillion. It's
Yeah,
technically kind of it's included in the book, but it's not technically part of the Silmarillion, is it? Because
Lost Tales also, because that was where he did his Atlantis mythology,
right.
some other versions of it.
But it's in the very end of the Silmarillion, John.
Yeah, and Other Minds magazine, both Other Hands, but especially Other Minds, because the Numenorian time period is what I ended up really focusing on for a lot of years. I did a lot more research in that area. And so I have multiple articles in Other Minds magazine covering the Numenorians and such, as well as some of the adventures and all. But others wrote about it as well through the different issues of Other Minds magazine. That's at omzine.org or othermindsmagazine.com.
Did we want to make any comments on kind of wrapping things up? Because I know we were reading kind of as a lead up to Tolkien Moot. We were
Fall of
reading through
Gondolin.
the Fall of Gondolin. So I don't know I think everybody here has had a chance to read through it and see all the different versions that Christopher puts together. We used, this is maybe a little mildly controversial, but we felt like we had the liberty to use
Mix and match the different versions
yeah,
as we wanted.
we did, because we used the version that had it was obviously an earlier version where the dragons and the Balrogs are not as they appear later, but it did have a lot more detail, and it's the one that starts out, "Then said Little Heart, son of Bronweg, know then that Tuor was a man who dwelt in very ancient days in that land of the north called Dorlomin, or Dorlomin, or the land of shadows, and of the Eldar that the Noldoli know it best." And that was the version we ended up reading, and I think we got pretty close to the end, but
Yeah, it fit the gamification
It did.
needs better.
yeah. So any last comments maybe, so we can kind of move on after today from the Fall of Gondolin?
John, you GM'd it. I know the political side was a struggle for you because you didn't know all of the political nuance of what was going on there, because we didn't have that all fleshed out in the campaign. We just said, oh, make sure here's the quick list of players, here's the NPCs, and here's some political strife going on. But you hadn't had a chance to really read through all of the Fall of Gondolin and the Silmarillion, which leads up to all that political stuff. So what were some of your thoughts from what you were able to glean about that political strife? Because that political strife is throughout the history of the Noldor, right? What happens in Gondolin is a microcosm of the other strife that happens between all the different factions over the eons.
Gondolin stays in Gondolin.
Well, to me,
they're all
part of the
dead.
difficulty was that I understood that people had conflicts, and other people said, "Oh, I should be the one in charge," and things like that. And I'm going to have this area after it's conquered. But I don't have any example of their personalities or their voices.
Yeah, and that would have required more time to be able to go through the Silmarillion and all the other sources.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody want to talk about that? The whole political strife of the different bands of the new. I mean, right? We have the Curse of the Sons, right, over the Silmarils and everything, and then all of the other stuff, and those who are trying to stay out of it and stay isolated, who keep getting drawn back in. And
I should say, do not take oaths lightly.
yes, yes, they have real power in Tolkien's world.
They do, and
Words have real power.
yeah, absolutely.
When you have a world built on music and words, a universe.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it really just preparing for this kind of, saturating myself in and rekindling, kind of an interest in that time period. I actually felt like the Battle of Unnumbered Tears became more significant to me. Because that was kind of one of the things we were doing was kind of in the background is kind of a paean or a tribute to it, kind of as the backdrop to, so in a sense, Gondolin gets away for another day.
Right.
But at the cost of so many who sacrificed. So even though that wasn't even part of the fall of Gondolin, Gondolin would have fell a lot earlier had it not been for those who covered the retreat
sacrificed,
and
yeah.
sacrificed. And the fact that Turgon took them out and tried, they were trying to, in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, to tilt the balance. And but for the treachery of men.
Right. Well, and the help of men.
Yeah, and the help of men.
Right. If it wasn't also for the help of the dwarves and men.
Yep.
And yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The losses would have been less if not for the treachery of men.
Right.
But if not for the men and the dwarves,
Right.
it would have been far worse.
Well, and then you have Tuor as kind of the ultimate, I suppose, archetype of the Edain. The elf friend who comes into Gondolin at the behest of Ulmo. No, oh my goodness, sorry.
Oh,
Come here.
That was unfortunate.
The fall of Elmo.
No. At the behest of Ulmo.
remember, Olmo was one of the gods from the water god and the
Yes.
sea and such.
Me want to throw myself off a cliff now. Okay. So anyway, but I think that's significant. You have absolutely, you're right, Hawk. You have those who are, and I think in some ways in the Jackson movies, Elrond seems a little bit too, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but a little too dismissive of men, and how men are fickle, I think is basically what he says.
Sure.
And I know that is definitely would be consistent in some ways to
Well,
think
he focuses on
but it's a little bit
Isildur. He's focusing
Right.
on Isildur's giving into the ring.
right.
That was his focus
right,
in the
that whole
movie.
foil,
Yeah.
right? Of
Yeah.
cast it into the fire, and
No.
I want it as as a weregild. Is it Sam? He wants it as a payment for his
Yeah.
father's
Yeah.
life.
Propitiation.
Yep.
Yeah, but I think that's a little bit strong compared to the real Elrond.
Well, and the half brother who chose mortal
Yeah.
mode instead, and the significance of his half brother's, lineage and all of that. So.
Can we just say how this also elevates Elrond? Because when you realize, and this is where I think knowing the first stage background a little bit helps. It's one thing when you're reading The Hobbit. You're like, oh, Bilbo comes along, Rivendell, this is a cool place.
There are moon letters here. See, from the cartoon version,
Yes.
you don't get the same feel.
right.
Yeah,
Or even Tralalali,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
exactly.
But as this kind of idea of this person kind of grows and waxes as we get older and as our depth of our knowledge of this secondary world that Tolkien crafted, it's like, oh, wait a minute. Now, the
Thousands
person
of years of
Elrond-
history upon his
I
shoulders.
mean, Earendel
us-
is his sire, right?
Yeah, and us who are
Yeah.
fathers who have daughters.
Yes.
Yes.
It had
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's
Well, I remember
total.
Yeah.
What's that, Sam?
I remember the first time that I read The Lord of the Rings after having read the Silmarillion. And then
Completely
went
different
through
experience.
Arendelle was a mariner that tarried in Arvernian, and Bilbo does that whole thing and asks Frodo what he thinks, and he's like, well, Aragorn just said, if you want to make poems about Arendelle and Elrond's house, that's your business. And it suddenly clicked why Aragorn would say that. It's like, yeah, that's pretty cheeky. I mean, and suddenly the impact of what Bilbo was attempting, really hit me after I had read the Silmarillion the first time. It's like, whoa, hang on a second here.
Yeah.
But I mean, the way in which Rivendell always stands as, and I have to say, the Second Age. This is partly why the Second Age also is very appealing to me, because there's more of Elrond in the Second Age.
Oh, yeah.
There's Celebrimbor in the Second
Oh, yeah,
Age.
yeah.
There's that whole, as it were, another version of the Long Defeat, where Rivendell gets created because they have to retreat from Austin Edhill and so you have like the last homely house is kind of this hidden, almost like Rivendell is a mini Gondolin.
There's an interesting.
Yeah.
There's an interesting theme too in how Turgon handles isolationism, like because sometimes that might be a good thing, and sometimes it might be a selfish or wrong thing in terms of the fate of Middle Earth. And there's multiple times where the story could go very different ways, like if he didn't let his sister leave, there would be no Miglin.
Yes.
If
Turgon,
like Hurin and Hur had been forced to stay, would that have changed the fate of the rest of the story? Gondolin wouldn't have been betrayed, maybe. There's just a lot of situations I can see where like it's actually hard to decipher what was the wiser choice, like to be 100% isolationist or not, and where has Turgon messed up in some way.
That's a good point.
Well,
and
each
there are
time-
parallels with that in Imladris. I
Well,
think.
over and over again, there's the theme of everybody trying to keep to their own space, and no, we need to unify, or we're going to get taken out. Divide and conquer one by one.
The Union of
And
Mithros.
it happens in Beleriand. It happens. I mean, first it happens all the way back in Valinor in a way.
Oh, you're right.
And then it happens in throughout Beleriand. Then once Beleriand's gone, it's happening throughout Middle Earth, and just a repeating of that. Not really learning from their lesson as they keep running off and hiding. Lorien, right, and they're being isolationists and such, and really not until the very end getting involved. Galadriel trying to hang on and preserve and stopping all change and all that stagnation.
But there are some situations like Nargothrond where
Right.
they would have benefited from being more isolationist and not so
Better
aggressive
hidden.
and
Right.
overt,
Sure.
Well, Turin is mostly to blame for that. I'm going to lay that at his feet
Yeah.
because they actually didn't send anyone to the Ninth Arnoidad.
Yeah. We're like, oh, you guys go fight that. That's up north.
Yeah. But,
We're down south.
But yeah, eventually you could all get.
Yeah, but a dragon can get there quite quickly.
Yes. So between the sons of Fëanor
Especially if they're from
and the curse of Morgoth on Hurin and his children, it's all Hey, could I have a quick comment then? This just kind of triggered thinking about the Three Rings, because we've mentioned Rivendell, we've mentioned Lothlorien, and those are two of the three places where the Elven rings are, right? So you have Galadriel holds.
And apparently for a little while in Gondolin, when we were doing the research, because it wasn't Círdan, spent time when we were doing the research in Gondolin for a while.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, well, that was
Okay.
part of what we shaped the story.
But that still would have been
And
pre-rings, though. Because Celebrimbor had...
Yeah,
hadn't
that's
crossed
that's
the
true.
rings yet.
But
Yeah, 'cause it's
that's
like-
right. You're right. Where was it that he went right after once the rings? Was it just Grey Havens?
Well, he would have been, so Círdan would have had
Okay.
Gandalf's ring
Right.
at the Great Havens, and then offered it to Olorin, not to...
That was much later, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, isn't it, to think, like, you have... The Three Rings seem to function in such a way, or at least two of the three, air and water, seem to function
Preservation.
as preservation. I mean, the
But that
ring
was-
of adamantine, especially in Lothlorien.
But that was the use. That was how they were choosing to use it. That was. I
not
think that was the
necessarily-
will
right.
of Galadriel,
Yeah,
and
it was
especially
the
in
will of
Elrond.
the elves to
Yeah.
keep things the same.
Yeah,
as
to
they had
resist the
always
change.
been.
But Gandalf was wielder of the flame
That's
of honor,
right.
right?
Yeah. Fire of change, I guess. But that was also Gandalf too.
Well,
right?
that's true.
He was roaming. He had no one place. He did not
Mischief
stay.
maker.
What if...
Yes, he was getting involved rather than isolating.
Spell
and-
named the
Well, the
yes.
elves are bound to Middle Earth, so it would make sense that they would want to keep things, like, be preservationists and sort of try to
Sure.
keep things the same.
Yeah.
I heard the most interesting... I'm sorry, I don't want to take us too much on tangent, but in hearing about the whole Tom Bombadil thing, which it doesn't have anything to do with this right now, but it was fascinating with this whole idea of elves and belonging to this world because of the Fëa and the Hroa,
right? Body and spirit.
Body and
yeah.
spirit. So Fëa being spirit, right? So
Yeah.
so the elves, they're the Fëa and the Hroa are meant. So you're bound, as it were, to Middle Earth, to Arda specifically. Whereas human beings are not.
Right.
That the Fëa, as it were, At least in his, in his world, they had a different destiny.
Because they have the gift of man. Yeah.
Right, but it's interesting too because it just mentions, just side note, that one theory that I thought was quite fascinating was the idea that Tom was the Fea of Arda.
Okay.
As a
embodied
personification.
Fea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, so does it wrap it up for the Fall of Gondolin then?
Sam, anything you wanted to add?
Shall we move on or anything else?
John?
I just had a quick question. Oh,
Go ahead.
well, did John want to say anything?
John, anything you wanted to add?
Nope, don't need anything.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you think that some of that, like, struggle, I'm going back to the whole isolationist thing, do you think that had anything to do with the Great War when Tolkien was writing this? Or
Well, so that's the problem, is we can always get into the how much of this is caused by this versus the amalgamation of his experiences with his creativity.
right?
It's that whole applicability thing, right? It is how much do we want to be a direct analog to those one specific or certain specific experiences versus the amalgam. And I think Tolkien's summary in Monsters and Critics about when you tear it apart down to the pieces too much, when you overanalyze it, well, he's talking about Beowulf and such.
Yeah.
But that when you tear that down too much and you lose the whole of it and you get in these little pieces,
Yes,
you
that's
lose
right.
the overall spirit and essence of it when you start getting down into the
Which is really
individual
fascinating
components.
because it kind of is the whole idea of how do you know things? Is it only through a scientific dissection of it to look at its constituent parts, or is there a knowing that it's different?
Well, there's a holistic approach versus a more elemental approach.
And there's a discussion in the metaphysics of Valor about that.
Valar?
About Fea, Roa, and the concept of Tolkien rejecting, I'm going to call it, it says Platonic dualism.
Or Platonic, right.
So if you
From Plato's
completely
specific-
separate the two, you're doing damage to
The whole.
The whole.
You're missing the point of the whole.
You're missing the point of the whole.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that is what Tolkien is rejecting
Right.
and saying, no, the two have to be together or else.
Right, because that was the
Yeah.
main problem with,
Yeah.
with the church in the Middle Ages was that idea that kind of borrowing from that Platonic ideal that if you that they were separated to too far apart, right?
Yeah, they're bound to one another.
Okay.
And so there's kind of this little concept of elvish reincarnation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why,
that
right?
comes in,
Because
yeah.
it's not saying this is the destiny of all beings in
Right.
Middle Earth. It's saying the elves have a very unique connection to Middle Earth, whereas
Yes.
not so with human beings.
Yeah.
So, to your question, comment, Noah, about World War II and Tolkien, of course,
World War
one. Sorry, well, one and two, really. Of course, it influenced him. Of course, it's a factor, but also he had a big understanding of history and of universal themes throughout mankind's literature. That those exact issues come up again and again and again and again. So we don't really know if it was specifically World War I that formed it into the story, or his exposure to all of these things. And now we can, well, yeah, it applies to World War I because historically we go through these things, isolationist swings, globalism, all these things come and go throughout history, throughout all of human history. And he had that profound knowledge of it, both literary and historically. So we can't really say, yes, it was this. We can look at all these parallels and go, well, it could be.
That's
It's
so-
certainly an influence. It
It's
had
so-
to be an influence.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? Because it's not that Tolkien was saying, look, it means less than allegory. He's saying it means more.
Right. Applicability. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. You could apply it to many different areas rather than I did not write it to be an allegory of World War One.
Yeah.
You could apply it to World War One. You could apply it to World War Two. You could apply it to you could apply it to all of these, which is so much more than if I had written it narrowly
Right.
to be this allegory, which is why he was frustrated with George MacDonald. Because he found that was so narrow.
Yeah.
But I
in-
think
in
that's
scope.
partly, and I know this was kind of something we covered at another time, so it's kind of, we can't unpack that right now. But I think part of it's because, A, he was older, and less tolerant as we've
Yes, he
as
got
we've
more and more
agreed,
curmudgeonly. Yes,
right?
he certainly did.
You know, initially saying the Golden Key, it's a great story, you know, and then later on,
And then went back and
thinking,
reread it.
"Horrible."
It's like, I can't stand
Can't
it in any
stand this
form.
stuff.
Yeah.
But I think secondly,
And I'm going to rewrite it.
I think he also perhaps knowing, I mean, he had such a great fund of knowledge, you know, the Fairy Queen and et cetera, throughout, you know, his medieval literature that he knew. I think maybe he dismissed MacDonald or others who write in a similar way too quickly.
Because MacDonald was writing, this is a children's book. And
Strongly allegorically and intentionally.
Yes, and
yeah.
Children love that.
And children love that.
Yeah.
And,
Well, and we use that
and my
to
children
train.
loved the Golden Key. It was one of their most. It was one of the ones that Matthias responded to the most.
And I would say it's because
Yeah.
children process reality differently than adults.
They process through play and exploration with the world. It's a whole neuroscience thing. We learn through especially initially, through physical interaction, and then later the more abstract stuff comes.
Exactly, because I think everything is an allegory at the beginning. You know, whenever I think of chairs, I may think of when I was, as a child, this one chair. This was like the chair that defines all other chairs, as it were. But then you get older, you start to realize, like, oh, it's not just about these archetypes or whatever.
Yeah,
but
you more broadly generalize.
More broadly
things.
generalize, yeah.
Stretch it out beyond the scope of just your concrete thinking stage.
Well, do we want to go into the letters?
Great. Yeah, sure. Do you know what letter we're really at? I was trying to do
boy.
process elimination.
I do not.
So the last one a few months back was 157, but I'm pretty sure we've read a bit past that. 158, 159. Okay, so we know we've read all the way up to 159 because of the June 2019 one, and we had one or two sessions since then. So that at least gives us a minimum. So 161. Okay, I don't think we read 161, which is really short but funny, just because of the opening sentence.
Okay, let's.
And so, if you have little children, plug your ears because HE double toothpicks. The map is.
Speaking of which, has anybody ever noticed that when the Hobbit and the dwarves get to the trolls, in that the trolls are like, what the hell?
Mm-hmm.
It's in. I didn't notice
It
that
is.
before.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, and he actually, the narrator breaks in beforehand and says, and this part, something about these trolls did not speak in very politely.
Yeah,
Yes, and that was a little surprising to
Wasn't
me
it?
as I was
Yeah,
reading it.
to
My
your little
daughter
kids,
this past week.
Yes.
Like, uh-oh.
Sorry.
Did
for
you
the
edit it
interruption.
to heck or something else? Or do you
No.
went with, okay,
No.
good. All right.
What letter again?
Didn't do the Disney movie re-edits out of Utah. Remember that was a whole
No,
movie company?
because like Tolkien, I hate Disney.
Okay, but I remember there was a company in Utah that was offering, this was back in VHS days.
Sure.
They would re-edit all the videos to be
yeah.
child
Yes,
appropriate, and they got
that's right.
sued big time.
Well, there's still
And
things
so
like that. Like
did,
VidAngel does the same thing.
So
nowadays.
did VidAngel.
Yeah.
VidAngel.
And
got
I don't
sued
mind
to
it
the
when
ground.
it's not
Yeah.
so much the words
Yeah.
as much as scenes that you're like, yeah, some parents don't
Sure.
necessarily want to see.
Yeah.
that.
Right.
What letter are we on? Again?
161 is what I'm guessing.
Yes.
Carry it on.
From a letter to Ray, and it's a really short one, so if you don't mind, I'll read. Actually, there's two
Please do.
super short ones, and then a super long one.
Ah,
Super long one. So we'll have to break that one up.
it's either long or short with the Tolkien.
It varies. All right, 161 from a letter to Rainer Unwin, 14th April 1955. The map is hell! Exclamation mark. I have not been as careful as I should in keeping track of distances. I think a large-scale map simply reveals all the chinks in the armor, besides being obliged to differ somewhat from the printed small-scale version, which was semi-pictorial.
Yeah.
May have to abandon it for this trip!
Yeah.
Exclamation mark.
Wow.
So you want to give context for folks like John and the others about what he's talking about there?
Well, I mean, I look at the map that's in my original Hobbit,
Mm-hmm.
and then I look at the map that Beth Ann so graciously brought home from England, and they're miles apart in detail, in
The
different.
Lord of the Rings map versus the
Yes.
the Hobbit map, yeah. which is also an analog to the difference in the stories, right?
Yeah.
It's more serious. It's a more serious map.
Yeah. One is very, I'll call it flowery, and the other one is
meant to be used as a cartographic tool.
Yeah.
I think it's in his first one.
John or Sam? Sam, do you have any comments? Okay, John.
Well, you also had so many different maps because of the areas that disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
The landscape actually changing.
Right. Yep.
I wonder how many intentional errors in the map that he put in there because of misreporting or anything like that.
I don't think he puts intentional errors. I think that's his cover story. Whenever there's errors, that's his. Well, it's because of this. Because, there's mistakes that are made. Yeah, that's it.
He just doesn't want to. It's harder for him to re-niggle.
That was the feeling I got.
It's harder for him to niggle in graphical form than it is in textual form.
We have Christopher was the one who really helped a lot with that.
Yeah.
So that was always my take. Is whatever he used it was an interpretation or it was a mistake of the narrator. It was always just kind of a way to kind of go, well, yeah, I can allow for that because that way I don't have to fix it.
Yeah.
Because he spent so much time agonizing and fixing the storylines with the later publications of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, trying to make it all sync
letter
up.
162 is relevant.
Yeah, so 162.
So this
Now you guys can see on the Jitsi image there, if you click on us, you'll see he's holding that up. So that's the Lord of the Rings map from the Red Book.
Yeah.
How different are the maps in the books from the ones in the role-playing game?
The role-playing game is very different stylistically, and it is embellished quite a bit.
I'm sorry.
The role-playing games zoom in a lot more and are much more stylistic, especially since Cubicle 7 took over.
Yep.
And then the old ones from Middle-earth, from Iron Crown Enterprises, were way off because they predate the history of Middle-earth. So after Middle-earth, everything just kind of the Pete Fenlon map, he made all kinds of stuff up, and he gets teased for everything off of Middle-earth being fjords everywhere. Right? The rest of the world is all filled with fjords except for Middle-earth. It's just every little nook, just everywhere. And, so he's gotten grief for that. And then later, as the History of Middle-earth books came out and it revealed more of Tolkien's world thing, that map became useless. And then we have Carolyn Fonstad's interpretations as well as, again,
it's probably the spectrum, isn't it? Like,
and then you have this David Salo guy who his stuff's all over the place as well.
Sure. Salo's done a lot on the languages, of course.
Yes.
But I feel like the maps, Christopher did a great job kind of improving on his father's work. I mean, again, so J.R.R. says, he had intended it somewhat pictorial, representation, which I think is so true, isn't it? It's like what you mentioned last time, Sam. We were discussing this last month. The idea of leaving something to the imagination, like some ambiguity that he's quite comfortable with. And I think maps are very disturbing in that if you try to get that kind of detail in, which he's now trying to do for the books, is he's realizing, it doesn't really leave.
Are we there yet?
Right. Less wiggle room. It leaves less wiggle room. Ambiguity.
Yes, exactly.
All right, 162 from a letter to Rainer Unwin, 18th April 1955. I have sent, registered under separate cover, Christopher's beautiful redrawing of the large-scale draft map I made of the area with which Volume 3 is mainly concerned. I hope it will be approved, ... The scale, which I noticed he had not inserted, is 5 times enlarged exactly from that of the general map.
Bad son.
I think he's saying good son.
The first thing in cartography is to have a scale and a compass.
Well, especially if you're English, because
Yes.
having lived in England, they're fastidious about this.
Well, old Greenwich, the old GMT thing.
I
Yes.
know.
Yeah.
And
The
there's-
meridian.
If you do the research, what you'll find is that in the Victorian era, starting in like the 1840s or 50s, they come up with this scale in which basically they map out all of Great Britain down to a certain, and I can't remember what the
Yeah.
scale is, and then that becomes like there's like three different scales.
One in 50,000.
Thank you.
1 in 50,000.
25?
25 and 1 in 10.
1 in 10.
Usually.
Not
Yeah.
obsessive at all.
Yeah.
Not obsessed at all. No.
Yeah.
And the close-up ones actually show almost every tree. I mean,
Yeah.
they're
Wow.
like that.
Wow.
And this is a fastidious rejection of the French metric system.
Oh.
This is the UK thumbing their nose at the French.
So they're
Using
like, no,
the
we're going to
imperial
go back
system
to
for
our
everything.
system.
Interesting.
Miles.
Our system's more important.
and then, of
than
course, you had the
yours,
whole-
silly.
the European Union.
Well, then and then you had the whole
Yeah.
true north and magnetic north thing to top it all
Yeah,
off. As
yeah.
far as
So I think of Brexit.
poor John
I think of
Franklin.
the whole thing of Brexit in the same
Yeah,
vein
yeah.
of
yeah.
well, they are an
But-
island.
we don't want to be part of your system. We're Brits.
It is very ancient, that.
Indeed.
In fact, one of the things a lot of Americans don't
Rome.
realize, whenever Americans put up two fingers and say, "I'd like two of this," in Britain, this is
Yes,
sorry,
that's-
I don't
yes.
need to offend any
Flipping
of our viewers.
somebody off.
It is, and it's
Yeah.
the story which has not been proven. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what
Is-
he's saying.
is
Doctor
that-
Who?
no, it goes back to the idea that the English longbow archers, when fighting against the French, were able to say that because what the French would do if they could
Cut off
get
those
to the
two
archers
fingers,
was
right.
cut off the two fingers,
Right.
Because they wouldn't have to kill them; they would just have to render
They
them.
take them out of commission.
Right,
yeah.
because these
Right.
guys, these longbow archers, had their arms
Yeah.
were very muscular. The shooting arm, they hold the bow. So anyway, so they basically be taunting the French by saying, "See, we still have our two fingers." And
Is that where I shall taunt you a second time?
you English Kniggets, except it's French Kniggets this time.
Yeah.
So anyway, I
Do
can
you-
see that.
Yeah. Do you want to take on 163?
Yeah.
I mean, we'll need to break it up because it's huge.
Okay, sure.
It is
Oh, yes.
pages.
I'll have a turn.
Okay. Have a go.
Okay. This one is to W.H. Auden. And there's a little footnote here, or rather a head note.
Preamble.
Preamble, thank you. Auden, who had reviewed The Fellowship of the Ring in the New York Times Book Review and Encounter, had been sent proofs of the third volume, The Return of the King. He wrote to Tolkien in April 1955 to ask various questions arising from the book. Tolkien's reply does not survive. Auden usually threw away letters after reading them. Auden wrote again on the 3rd of June to say that he had been asked to give a talk about The Lord of the Rings on the BBC third program in October. He asked Tolkien if there were any points he would like to hear made in the broadcast and whether he would supply a few human touches in the form of information about how the book came to be written. Tolkien's reply survives because on this occasion, and when he subsequently wrote to Auden, he kept a carbon copy from which this text is taken. Thank you, Tolkien, for keeping copies of your letters. I'd like to know what Auden's questions were. 7th June 1955.
It might be odd.
Dear Auden, I was very pleased to hear from you and glad to feel that you were not bored. I am afraid that you may be in for rather a long letter again, but you can do what you like with it. I type it so that it may be, at any rate, be quickly readable. I do not really think that I am frightfully important. I wrote the trilogy as a personal satisfaction, driven to it by the scarcity of literature of the sort that I wanted to read, and what there was often heavily alloyed. A great labor, and as the author of the oh, Sam, help me out here. Ancrene Vissa? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Old English, I
He
think.
just nodded yes.
Okay. Says, at the end of his work, I would rather, God be my witness, set out on foot for Rome than begin the work ever again. But unlike him, I would not have said, read some of this book at your leisure every day, and I hope that if you read it often, it will prove very profitable to you. Otherwise, I shall have spent my long hours very ill. I was not thinking much of the profit or delight of others, though no one can really write or make anything purely privately. And there's a footnote on his use of the word trilogy, which we can get to at the end.
Mm-hmm.
However, when the BBC employs anyone so important as yourself to talk publicly about the trilogy, not without reference to the author, the most modest, or at any rate retiring of men, whose instinct is to cloak such self-knowledge as he has, and such criticisms of life as he knows it, under mythical and legendary dress, cannot help thinking about it in personal terms, and finding it interesting and difficult, too, to express both briefly and accurately. The Lord of the Rings, as a story, was finished so long ago now that I can take a largely impersonal view of it, and find interpretations, quote, quite amusing, even those that I might make myself, which are mostly post-scriptum. I had very little particular conscious intellectual intention in mind at any point. Take the Ents, for instance. I did not consciously invent them at all. The chapter called Treebeard, from Treebeard's first remark on page 66, was written off more or less as it stands, with an effect on myself, except for labor pains, almost like reading someone else's work.
The muses add him.
And I like Ents now because they do not seem to have anything to do with me. I dare say something had been going on in the unconscious for some time, and that accounts for my feeling throughout, especially when stuck, that I was not inventing but reporting, imperfectly, and had at times ought to wait until what really happened came through. But looking back analytically, I should say that Ents are composed of philology, literature, and life. They owe their name to the Eald Enta Gewerk of Anglo-Saxon.
Underline that.
And their connection with stone. Yeah, that's a comment to Old Giant Works.
Yes.
Their part in the story is due, I think, to my bitter disappointment and disgust from school days with the shabby use made in Shakespeare of the coming of great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill. I longed to devise a setting in which the trees might really march to war. And into this has crept a mere piece of experience, the difference of the male and female attitude to wild things, the difference between unpossessive love and gardening. Except,
I'm sorry. For one who has 3 acres, that is a true statement.
Except for a few deliberately disparaging reviews, such as that of Volume 2 in the New Statesman, in which you and I were both scourged with such terms as pubescent and infantilism. What appreciative readers have got out of the work or seen in it has seemed fair enough, even when I do not agree with it. Always excepting, of course, that any interpretations, quote, in the mode of simple allegory, that is, the particular and topical. In a larger sense, it is, I suppose, impossible to write any story that is not allegorical in proportion as it comes to life, since each of us is an allegory, embodying in a particular tale and clothed in the garments of time and place, universal truth and everlasting life. Boom. I think you just said it much better than any of us did.
Underline that whole section.
Yeah, absolutely. Where's your pencil? Here. Thank you. Sam, do you have a copy? Did you want to read?
163.
Microphone by my mouth. That helps. Yeah, I can read for a bit.
Yeah, we'll break it up across.
Did you stop mid-paragraph, though, Brian?
I did. The first, it's the next sentence is, anyway, most people that have enjoyed The Lord of the Rings.
Ah, yes. Yeah, okay. Anyway, most people that have enjoyed The Lord of the Rings have been affected primarily by it as an exciting story, and that is how it was written. Though one does not, of course, escape from the question, what is it about, by that back door. That would be like answering an aesthetic question by talking of a point of technique. I suppose that if one makes a good choice in what is good narrative or good theater at a given point, it will also be found to be the case that the event described will be the most significant. To turn, if I may, to the human touches and the matter of when I started. That is rather like asking of man when language started. It was an inevitable, though conditionable, evolvement of the birth given. It has always been with me. The sensibility to linguistic patterns, which affects me emotionally, like color or music, and the passionate love of growing things, and the deep response to legends, for lack of a better word, that have what I would call the Northwestern temper and temperature. In any case, if you want to write a tale of this sort, you must consult your roots, and a man of the Northwest of the Old World will set his heart and the action of his tale in an imaginary world of that air and that situation, with the shoreless sea of his innumerable ancestors to the west, and the endless lands, out of which enemies mostly come, to the east. Though in addition his heart may remember, even if he has been cut off from all oral tradition, the rumor all along the coasts of the men out of the sea. I say this about the heart, for I have what some might call an Atlantis complex. Possibly inherited, though my parents died too young for me to know such things about them, and too young to transfer such things by words. Inherited from me, I suppose, by only one of my children, presumably referring to Christopher, be my thought, without looking at the footnotes yet, though I did not know that about my son until recently, and he did not know it about me. I mean, the terrible recurrent dream, beginning with memory, of the great wave towering up and coming in ineluctably over the trees and green fields. I bequeathed it to Faramir. I don't think I have had it since I wrote The Downfall of Numenor as the last of the legends of the First and Second Age.
Okay.
Wow. Any comments that anyone wants to make on what we've read so far? Because there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
Some of it he's referring to things we've already talked about and discussed. But anybody else?
The admission of the Atlantis complex is
Well, he did rewrite
clues me in to
that part
some of
several
that.
times.
And yeah, I wonder if Stephen Arlaw had some, whether he used Tolkien as a source or he used the original sources as a
Stephen
source.
Arlott.
Stephen Arlaw had wrote Taliesin, Merlin, Arthur, Pendragon.
Right, okay.
And his story of the fall of Atlantis has some themes, I think, from here, but I don't know whether they're themes from the original source or from Tolkien. So
I
Can you
find...
define Atlantis complex?
What does he
saying
mean by
to
that?
define it?
Yeah.
Myth in our world, maybe? Connection to... Trying to connect mythology to our lives?
And specifically some vestige, maybe, of...
Yeah, remnant of it, fall from greatness.
Yeah.
There was decline.
And water as judgment, maybe,
Yeah.
or as change or something.
yeah,
But Tolkien here mentions a recurrent dream too, so that would also play into a complex that he had a dream of a great wave washing over wherever he is or whatever land he's referring to. So it's not
Or the
just,
destruction of civilization.
It's not just an intellectual or a literary or mythological
Fear.
fascination or complex here either. If he's got dreams about it, it's also psychological, mental, perhaps spiritual.
Yeah, I interpreted the Atlantis complex as like something that's haunting him. And actually, it's interesting to the way I sort of read the letter. Maybe I'm wrong, but the way I'm sort of reading this is that in writing out the story of the downfall of Numenor, like he sort of in the process of doing that, he overcame that haunting dream. You know, it says I don't think since I don't think I've had it since I wrote the downfall of Numenor.
mm-hmm.
So he got it out of his system.
He got it out of his system, exactly.
He also he came from another place, South Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and
So-
a place where he will never go back to.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that.
That sense of separation.
Right.
A
There's
place you can never go back to.
Did he go by boat or by land from South Africa.
Oh, by boat, most assuredly.
Yes. And so was there some sort of great storm that he
As a young
the,
boy.
the channel can be
experienced.
Mediterranean channel can be unpredictable.
Yeah.
So-
Certainly in the ocean is a
There
very intimidating.
There's some speculation.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, didn't they speculate that? I don't know if it's true or not. So I may have picked up false info on this. But didn't they speculate that his whole spider thing was because he got bit in Africa at some point when he was a kid?
Maybe.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so that kind of stuck with him.
So it's one of the
Yeah.
ingredients.
and you know,
for sure.
spiders look much more giant when you're a tiny kid.
This is true. This is true.
So it grows in your
I love how he
imagination.
says here.
Yeah.
Not to mention African spiders. Reports are some of them are pretty darn huge.
Oh, Australian are the worst. In any case, if you want to write a tale, he says, of this sort, you must consult your roots, and a man of the northwest of the old world will set his heart and the action of his tale in an imaginary world of that era. I just, that's fascinating to me because I have felt, and I know Sam feels this as well, probably all of us do to some extent, maybe this is why Tolkien appeals to us. I don't know. I mean, I think I share, even though I didn't grow up like he did. Oh, thanks, Hawk.
Well, because I remember soldiers reporting these huge spiders in Iraq and Afghanistan,
Yeah.
leg span 5.5 inches.
Wow. Yeah.
Camel spiders.
Yep, camel spiders.
Yeah.
Man. Well, it's because they get them off.
What's
the
even
heat of the
scarier
sun.
is the spider camels.
They have 8
We've got a
humps.
new monster for Monster Manual, John. I mean, that would
I'm
creep
pretty
me
sure that
out.
was on Stranger Things.
Yeah.
No, I was just saying before Hawk threw a giant spider at me.
And apparently it was only discovered in 2010
Wow.
ish.
Well, the ones before I think were the whip spider, the whip scorpions or whatever. That they look like spiders, but they have
Yeah.
jagged teeth. No, I was just gonna say I feel like I didn't obviously grow up with the same background as Tolkien or whatever, but maybe for Americans, at least over here on the West side, or even maybe anywhere in the U.S., the Old West would be kind of for us, harking back to a time where there's some kind of like deep cultural kind of imprint, that
Yep.
you know what I'm trying to say here.
Yep. I know
That
exactly
people
what
would
you're trying to
draw
say.
upon as like a motif or whatever for maybe future stories. But for me, when I read the stories of the North, like when I read a lot of mythology as a child, and the Norse mythology with the 9 worlds really was pretty evocative to me. And I didn't know the legends as well. I wish I had been more well read in some of the legends like Sigurd and all those. But what I did know, I mean, I was really fascinated by and very, very influenced by, probably Northwest European
Sure.
ideas. So it's kind of secondhand smoke,
Mm-hmm.
but, I don't know. But I like what he's saying. He's saying, well, really the story is growing out of my native soil. It's just that Tolkien was more... Will you stop it, Hawk?
Do you have arachnophobia?
You're getting distracted here.
Sorry.
No, I don't actually have
Okay,
arachnophobia.
good. Danielle does.
Yes. Good thing she's
One of our
not here.
GMs. Yeah. John keeps sending
Danielle
spiders
wants
after
to
her.
see camel spiders.
Sorry.
Well, anyway, that was all I had to say.
Okay. So,
It's okay.
squirrel.
Spider.
Giant spider. That might be a bit of a distraction. I mean, they get pretty good size here in Spokane. They can get like that.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Out in the desert where we are,
yeah, even
Not
bigger.
not so much
I,
that. but
here, in my house,
but,
I've seen them
yeah.
like that. So,
I've mowed off several rattlesnakes already.
oh boy,
So
oh boy,
That's the 3 acres.
that's a good
That's
reason
a-
for being up on wheels.
That's a
instead.
different.
Yeah, that's a whole other beast.
Yeah, my daughter comes
I can just see
screaming, running into the house, and it's just this baby bull snake that's just not bigger than a garter snake. Is it poisonous, Dad? Is it poisonous?
I was just thinking from the snake's point of view,
Yeah.
how its dream would be like the terrible recurrent dream beginning with memory of the
Right.
great mower towering up and coming in ineluctably over the trees and green fields. It's coming! Run for you! Wait,
Well, and,
wait, wriggle for your life.
as well, and the hundreds of field mice that
Yeah.
scamper off.
I'm thinking the snake must be
man.
thanking
Yeah.
you, like, "Hey, thanks, man, for flushing these out."
Gulp.
All right,
Yeah.
All right.
we better continue the letter.
Continue, yes, it's a
wants to
long
read?
one.
You want to read?
Sure.
All right.
Where are we? To
You stopped right there.
Oh.
I'm a West Midlander.
I am a West Midlander by blood, and took to an early West Midland Middle English as a known tongue. Do you mean kind of this Welsh, partial Welsh dialect?
Talk to the linguist, Sam.
Welsh
dialect?
would be West Midland. You're talking more his Suffolkshire
Okay.
background. And of
All
course,
right.
during Middle English, we don't have yet a set alphabet either. If you look at
Yeah, that's true.
Gawain and the Green Knight and others, there are some different symbols depending on which part of the country you're in, if you want to talk about orthography rather than just speech and accent.
Yeah.
But don't we use something like a Wessex, or like the more London? I mean, the form of English, the dialect that eventually came over here would have
Yeah.
been not a West Midlands one.
Well, it was many. I mean, we had
Yeah.
Irish,
Well,
Scottish.
a number
But
of
Scotch,
we're not talking about
Irish, yeah.
accents here, but yeah, dialect
Yeah.
actually of English.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. But perhaps a fact of my personal history may partly explain why the Northwestern air appeals to me both as home and as something discovered. I was actually born in Bloemfontein, and so those deeply implanted
Spiders.
impressions, underlying memories that are so pictorially available for inspection of first childhood are, for me, those of a hot, parched country. My first Christmas memory is of blazing sun, drawn curtains, and a drooping eucalyptus.
Hmm.
I am afraid this is becoming a dreadful bore, and had going on too long, at any rate, longer than this contemptible person before you merits. But it is difficult to stop once roused on such an absorbing topic as oneself as oneself. As for the conditioning,
Too true.
I am chiefly aware of the linguistic conditioning. I went to King Edward's School and spent most of my time learning Latin and Greek, but I also learned English, not English literature, except Shakespeare, which I disliked cordially.
But it's
How do you
cordially.
How
It's
do you
not.
dislike
It's not
something
as
cordially?
Right?
well. He does it like vehemently the way he does.
McDonald.
Right.
No, older Chaucer.
Chaucer.
stuff.
Lang.
Oh yeah.
What?
Or Andrew Lang.
Yeah.
No, he did like Andrew Lang, but he kind of had some.
Yeah. So. But
But
Chaucer.
his. Go ahead.
Did he not like Chaucer?
I thought he was like pretty vehement about
Yeah.
some of that. Like
Well-
more than it was not cordial. Just like.
It was probably because of the great vowel shift. He was all upset about that.
Well, there was so
Well-
much emphasis on that. Particular, I remember it was Chaucer who it was, but that there was so much emphasis in
Taking
school
English in a
on it,
continental direction.
and
Oh,
well, and
yes.
focusing on
Yes,
that
yes,
particular
yes,
version,
yes.
and he just like was vehement about it. Not it was not cordial.
Yes.
Yes, everything wrong started in 1066. Boo.
But nothing happened in 787. The chief contacts with poetry were when one was made to try to translate it into Latin. Not a bad mode of introduction, if a bit casual. I meant something of the English language and its history. I learned Anglo-Saxon at school, also Gothic, but that was an accident quite unconnected With the curriculum, though decisive, I discovered in it not only modern historical philology, which appealed to the historical and scientific side, but also, for the first time, a study of language out of mere love. I meant for the acute aesthetic pleasure derived from a language for its own sake, not only free from being useful, but free even from being the vehicle of a literature.
Celador.
There are two strands, or three, a fascination that Welsh names had for me, even if only seen on coal trucks from childhood, is another, though people only gave me books that were incomprehensible to a child when I asked for information. I did not learn any Welsh till I was an undergraduate, and found it in an abiding linguistic aesthetic satisfaction. Spanish was another. My guardian was half Spanish, and in my early teens, I used to pinch his
That's
books
important to note.
and try to learn it. The only Romance language that gives me particular pleasure, of which I am speaking, it is not quite, meaning that Latin and French give him no
Yes.
no
Exactly.
pleasure. It is not quite the same as the mere perception of beauty. I feel the beauty of, say, Italian, or for that matter of modern English, which is very remote from my personal taste. It is more like the appetite for a needed food. Most important, perhaps, after Gothic, was the discovery in Exeter College Library, when I was supposed to be reading for honor mods, of a Finnish grammar.
I love it. He's supposed to be studying for one thing and he gets sidetracked with Finnish grammar.
Perfect. It was like discovering a complete wine cellar filled with the bottles of an amazing wine of a kind of flavor never tasted before. It quite intoxicated me, and I gave up on an attempt to invent an unrecorded Germanic language, and my own language, or series of invented languages, became heavily Finnicized in phonetic pattern and structure. So there answers one of the mysteries.
Yeah, the Elvish
Yes.
derivation. Yeah.
I never knew that he liked Spanish so much.
Yeah, I didn't. The Spanish part, that's new. That's news to me. I knew he had a
Well-
smattering of it. I didn't realize that link with the caretaker.
Yeah.
It's a regular language. Spanish is, there's very few exceptions in its structure and rules. Japanese is very much the same way.
Yeah, highly
There's
structured
Very,
and-
very
yeah.
few exceptions to
Yeah.
the rules.
Right.
Self-consistent.
Whereas English,
Well, because
and
it's a
especially-
hodgepodge. Yeah.
and especially Welsh, is probably what isn't an exception.
Could it be also that with English, one of the strengths of English is that we borrow so heavily from other languages,
Yes.
whereas that is also its own weakness, that it doesn't feel as, I suppose, original. You know, in terms of like its original beauty, right? Because it has morphed so much. Whereas, I don't know, perhaps Spanish has changed less over the years. But Sam, you're a Spanish teacher. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I wondered briefly, or maybe I'm still wondering briefly, I don't know. When he mentioned Spanish, in comparison with French, Spanish shifted differently than French did because of the Moorish invasion of Spain,
Sure.
of the Iberian Peninsula, more
Yeah.
correctly, in 700s, I believe it would have been. And then they remained there until 1492 with the Reconquista, the reconquest by
Right.
Ferdinand and Isabella, in which they tried to get rid of all the Muslims and Jews. Sort of a Spanish nationalist movement. But because of that, Spanish, 1/3 of the vocabulary of Spanish is from Arabic, which,
Wow.
whether Tolkien was aware of this or not, or
Huh.
whether he was at all interested in Arabic, I don't see any indication anywhere that he was. But it would give it a definite different influence and sound than French or even Italian, Romanian, the other Romance languages, because of that Arabic influence
Oh.
and not so much of the Northern European influence.
Well, I'm completely wrong then. It did
As
borrow.
far as how Spanish has changed, we have a lot of different words in Spanish from the New World, from the
Yes.
conquest of the New World. And
Yes.
as you go to different countries,
Oh, the
you'll hear
natives.
those. For
Yeah.
example, right, native words. So when I was speaking Spanish to Mexicans a number of years ago here in the States, one particular day at work,
My
I always sat
brother
at the
had this
Spanish-speaking
conversation,
table
yeah.
because all the English speakers left for lunch. And I sat at the Spanish table, and hey, what you gonna do tonight after work? Blah blah blah. Well, I'm gonna cut the, and the guy says sacate. Everybody at the table understood what he meant except for me. I said, "What do you mean sacate? What's sacate?" Like, you don't know what sacate is? I said, "No, I don't know what sacate is." He says, "Pasto." I said, "Oh, well, then why didn't you say that in the first place?" It was grass. But in Peru, we don't use the word sacate. We say hierba or pasto.
Yeah.
On the flip side, when I'm with my Peruvian friends or in Peru, which has been quite a long time, but where I grew up, we always use the word cocha, which is a Quechua word. So it's an Inca word for lake.
Yeah.
Mexicans don't know the word cocha. If I say cocha, they'll have no clue what I'm talking about.
So he should talk to my brother, because my brother's been working on his multiple my brother's been working on, he's been trying to get his PhD, and I think he's finally given up on it, but he has two masters, and the one he was working towards PhD was he was in Spain because he couldn't find the degree he wanted in the United States, and it's something to do with Spanish philology, literature, philosophy, and poetry.
Oh, wow.
Something like, I don't know exactly. I don't fully understand what his degree is about. It's so arcane.
That sounds
But
like
and
you
he's
should talk to
especially like
Sam.
1800s Spanish philology or whatever. So
Right.
he had to go to Spain for that, and he'd have to go in and out of, because he'd have to renew his visa every 6 months. So he'd go Morocco and France and all that, go in and out. But he lived for years in Guatemala. His wife is Mexican. Both his sons are from there, from Mexico, and so he's been all over, Mexico, Central, northern part of South America, all the different Spanish-speaking places for decades. And now to make a living, he's doing online, like real-time training and translations for Spanish-speaking professionals trying to learn English and stuff. But they gave him, instead of the PhD he was working all those years on, they gave him a European master's, because they were being kind of snooty about his American master's from Olympia or whatever, New York. I mean, it's a prestigious school and all that, but they were being European snobs and just gave him another master's. So that was frustrating for him. So he never quite finished. It's something he's been working on and off forever. Yeah. But it sounds like you two maybe should meet remotely or something.
Yeah.
You might have an
I don't know
awful
much
lot.
about the history of Spanish. I
I could be
learned.
completely wrong. It may all be literature. I don't fully understand.
But philology is
It feels like it's a
It would still be
mixture of all of
enjoyable.
those. Yeah, I think you guys would have an awful lot to
Sam's
just
a philologist at heart.
geek out about.
Oh yeah.
Well, Noah, you have studied Spanish a little bit. Did you have any comments on this? Anything you wanted to share?
I didn't get very far. I took 3 semesters in college, but and I've been to Guatemala. But I mean, I totally agree with what Sam said. I knew about the whole Arabic influence,
Okay.
like Taza.
Well, I knew
like Taza,
historically about
depending
it,
on
but
where
it
you're
didn't
from.
click in my head about the linguist. Like, makes total sense. Duh. Historically, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes complete sense that it would influence that, but I didn't make that linguistic association to the historical situation.
Yeah, there's even an interesting kind of long connection with Numenor, which we were talking about earlier, which is kind of like the whole idea of colonialism or whatever, because in a way the Spanish conquistadors, this is oversimplifying it, but their approach to the New World is basically copied from their approach in the Reconquista, and
Interesting.
and kind of a Spanish crusade to liberate, Iberia as they saw it from the interlopers who'd been there for 600 years or 700 years. But they took that same approach and they just exported it, and so that's why specifically you see the conquistadors, along with just normal human greed and everything.
Right, but
exploiting
the method they used in South and Central America,
Oh.
of just stripping
right?
all the resources.
And we're
You're
still
right, yeah.
we're still seeing the. I think
Yeah.
we're still seeing the effects of that.
The
Yeah.
country of California. And the independent
Well, the other thing, if you want to talk about Atlantis, the Basques, according to their own mytho-history, are the descendants of the survivors of Atlantis
Oh,
Interesting.
in northern Spain.
huh.
Now, mentioned it to a Basque guy that I met last summer, and he's a high schooler. He was not aware of that. But at some point in my studies, I read that the Basques' mytho-history is that they're the descendants of Atlantis.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if it would connect to Atlantis or not, but Basque is an isolate as a language.
Sure.
There are no living languages related to Basque. It's been influenced by Spanish, of course, having been in Spain, and I would guess a little bit in France. I think they kind of curve around through the Pyrenees a little bit. You get some in southern France. But it is an isolate as a language, and at some point claimed to be descendants of the survivors of Atlantis.
And this is
Which
why
has an
they're
interesting
trying
thought.
to secede.
Oh no, well, they have, but that's just a long,
Yeah. That's
long-term
a
independence movement.
yeah.
Can I don't know where we're at with time.
We've got
Did we get to the end of the letter?
17 minutes left. We're still not finished
Okay,
the letter.
maybe we should get back to it.
Do you want to know it?
No,
Sure. I don't think we'll get to. Well,
Well, we
maybe.
might.
I could.
I have a
But
question.
yes, go ahead, John.
Yeah.
Where did we leave off?
We are.
Um,
John's.
So with the languages
Finish
that
this.
Tolkien wrote, did he show any development in the languages? Were they dead languages from the beginning, or did Elvish change from the first age to the third age? Was there any additionals? Did Easterly language leak in, or anything like that? Was there any?
I think it
or
was
all the languages
more.
set in stone from day one.
I think he was more story driven about the change, wasn't he? That he didn't really. I mean, you did see the bleed between Grey Elf and Sylvan and Quenya, but I think he said that language is an evolving, changing thing. He very much had the concept of language evolving, but didn't he pretty much just link it to historical changes, changing it? That as events
Internal?
and things, as events happened, that changed the language. So the language grew and changed due to these events. New words were created
As
because of
opposed
these
to
traumas,
borrowing.
etc.
Yeah.
As opposed to borrowing from the other languages, except for from the Elvish languages. That the
Right.
Elvish language interspersed between each other, but not
Quenya was always
Dwarvish or any of
considered
the others.
right, not from Dwarvish.
Yeah. But that Westron, the Mannish language,
Adonaic.
was derived from aspects of Elvish and other things that it did. I think it did have some. I think he did list that Adonaic had some.
But that makes a lot of sense because from the very beginning, elves teach things to speak. They,
Right.
they wake
They
the
were the
trees.
speakers, yeah.
They're the speaker. So they do that very
It's a good question, John.
uniquely. And so I mean, but John, it might help you too. So Quenya was considered kind of like the Elvish Latin, right? And this also ties into Numenor because you have these elevated or ennobled men given this land, Atalante, Numenor or Atlantis, and so
Westerness.
within that Westerness, so they speak in, not Quenya, but they speak in
Sindarin.
Sindarin,
Yeah, Grey Elf.
right? Gray elves, but
Noldor and-
their names, the royal names, the royal title. They were always in Quenya because that's like that Elvish Latin. It's
Well,
kind of
and that was a
high
big part
Elvish.
of what happened with Doriath. Greymane.
Thingol.
Thingol gave the edict. You will not speak the tongue of the Noldor in our realm
Right.
upon punishment. And that was because of the curse of the Noldor and everything, and bringing that to the land.
Yeah, the kinslaying. And
So
all
you had
that.
a real pushback against that
It's a shibboleth.
being spoken.
Yeah.
And so you really saw that switch to only Quenya, and then, Sindarin, and Quenya being more of an artifact.
But going back to the earlier thing, I think, and this is kind of what Hawk you were saying, events shaped it, right? So the reason why there is a difference between High Elven and Gray Elven would be that the Sindarin would have evolved as as an Elvish language in Middle Earth, never having gone over to Valinor, whereas those who went over to Valinor, to Aman, it would have. I suppose the idea was it would have stayed the same, whereas the Sindarin would have kind of changed over time into this separated kind of Elvish language with common roots. Sam, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if you're going to separate languages and cultures for a long period of time where there's no contact, they're going to develop separately. And the longer time that they're apart, the less likelihood you'll see that they're related, or the less likely you'll see the roots. You'll have to do a lot more study there. The other thing, thinking of Elvish men, is that you've sort of got, since the Elvish are called the firstborn, it's not quite a supremacist complex, but you're less likely to see the elves learning things from men or adapting their languages than you are to have the men listening to the elves.
Right.
The men are coming in going, "Oh wow, look at these amazing beings. We want to be like them," or I mean the good ones, so to speak. We'll learn to be like them. We'll learn from them. But you never get any attitude from the elves. I mean, they're allies, but you don't get an attitude from the elves of what can we learn from men.
Right.
You see that with
You
the
know,
dwarves too.
it's very much a tutor to student type of idea rather than an equal to equal sense.
Yeah.
Well, and Finrod Felagund, right? He's the one. He's called Felagund because he's that's Hewer of Caves. But he's at some point he's described, isn't he, as a friend to the men because he's the one who sits there and he teaches them, doesn't he?
Nome, or the name
Yeah.
sounds kind of like similar to gnome.
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean something like that?
I can't. Yeah,
I forget. But
I forget it too.
Yeah.
Well,
Good question, John.
yeah.
Want to go ahead, Noah?
Feel free to put the brakes on me. I know
Go
we're
for it.
pressed for time. Going back to heavily phonicized phonetic pattern and structure, that is, of course, long past now. Linguistic taste changes like everything else as time goes on, or oscillates between poles. Latin and the British type of Celtic have it now, with the beautifully coordinated and patterned, if simply patterned, Anglo-Saxon near at hand, and further off the Old Norse, with the neighboring but alien Finnish. Roman British, might not one say? With a strong but more recent infusion from Scandinavia and the Baltic. Well, I dare say such linguistic tastes, with due allowance for school overlay, are as good or better a test of ancestry as blood groups. All this only a background to the stories, though languages and names are for me inextricable from the stories. They are and were, so to speak, an attempt to give a background or a world in which my expressions of linguistic taste could have a function. The stories were comparatively late in coming. I first tried to write a story when I was about 7. It was about a dragon. I remember nothing about it except a philological fact. My mother said nothing about the dragon, but pointed out that one could not say a green great dragon, but had to say a great green dragon.
Oh.
I wondered why, and still do. The fact that I remember this is possibly significant, as I do not think I ever tried to write a story again for many years, and was taken up with the language.
Wow.
I mentioned Finnish because that set the rocket off in story. I was immensely attracted by something in the air of the Kalevala, even in Kirby's poor translation. Ouch. I never learned
Ouch is
Finnish
right.
well enough to
Wow.
do more than plod through a bit of the original, like a schoolboy with Ovid, being mostly taken up with its effect on, quote, my language. But the beginning of the Legendarium, of which the trilogy is part, the conclusion, was in an attempt to reorganize some of the Kalevala, especially the tale of Kullervo the Hapless, into a form of my own. That began, as I say, in the Honor Mods period, nearly disastrously as I came very near having my exhibition taken off me, if not being sent down. Say 1912 to 1913. As the thing went on, I actually wrote in verse, though the real story of this imaginary world, almost fully formed as it now appears, was written in prose during sick leave at the end of 1916, the fall of
Yes.
Gondolin,
Yes.
which I had the cheek to read to the Exeter College Essay Club in 1918. I wrote a lot else in hospitals before the end of the Great War. I went on after return. but when I attempted to get any of this stuff published, it was not successful. The Hobbit was originally quite unconnected, though it inevitably got drawn into the circumference of the greater construction, and in the event modified it. It was unhappily really meant, as far as I was conscious, as a children's story, and as I had not learned since then, and my children were not quite old enough to correct me, it has some of the silliness of manner caught unthinkingly from the kind of stuff I had had served to me, as Chaucer, here we go, may catch a minstrel tag. I deeply regret them. So do intelligent children.
See, I mean, he's not polite about it.
Yeah. All I remember about the start of The Hobbit is sitting correcting school certificate papers and the everlasting weariness of that annual task forced on impecunious academics with children.
That's why, because it was forced on him. That's why he's so bitter about it.
On a blank leaf, I scrawled, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." I did not and do not know why. I did nothing about it for a long time, and for some years I got no further than the production of Thror's map. But it became The Hobbit in the early 1930s and was eventually published, not because of my own children's enthusiasm, though they liked it well enough, but because I lent it to the then Reverend Mother of Sherwell Edge when she had the flu, and it was seen by a former student who, at that time, was in the office of Allen Unwin. It was, I believe, tried out on Rainer Unwin, but for whom, when grown up, I think I should never have got the trilogy published.
Good old Rainer.
So this comes up over and over and over and over again in our meetings about the Kalevala, and that was interesting to hear about that translation, which is what I think is the public domain one that you can get off of the web. This is meant to be easier for kids and such. It's turned into a narrative, but it also has alongside it the poems in the original meter and such, but translated. But these are by Finns. These are native Finns translating it rather than a British imperialist translation, right? You know? So, and I'm full disclosure, I'm half Finnish, so my dad has always felt very connected with the Finnish side and everything, and all my dad's family, much of them, they're all Upper Peninsula, Minnesota. There's just a concentration of Finns there. Minnesota.
Oh, Minnesota.
Yeah, no, Michigan's more Dutch and
more
stuff
Duluth
like that.
area.
Yeah, Duluth and Embarrass and all of that.
Go Packers.
I wonder if we shouldn't. I mean, we did long ago. We went through I think it was a different version of the Kalevala, but we went through the whole story because Turin Turambar was based on Kalervo. And Kalervo is, as we read the Kalevala, it took us a couple of sessions, I think, to get through, was not a likable guy. He had no redeeming qualities. No wonder, and he kept going, why does everything bad keep happening to me? You keep doing bad stuff.
Bad Kalervo. Bad Kalervo.
Exactly. And you keep complaining. And it was clearly a children's thing to teach kids to not be bad, right?
Yeah.
If you do these bad things will happen to you. The gods will punish you. But we never did any of the other stories. We focused just on Kalervo, because of Turin Turambar, but we haven't really ever gone through to figure out how many other stories, because we know, as he says there, how much the Kalevala was formative for him. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't integrate a little bit, because the way this one's laid out is really accessible. So it's got nice little artwork and such, but it has the little poetry snippet. So say, long ago the nature's daughter, Luonatar, the airy virgin, kept her chastity for ages, nursed her purity for eons, on the vast and endless acres, on the level plains of heaven. But then it switches to regular prose and such, and gives a nice, detailed story with the little poem snippets.
This explains a lot about Tolkien when you think about like the Lay of Lathian, and then you've got
By the way, our
prose versions of Perrin Baron Luthien.
Our project name for the software I was telling you about is Project Ilmatar.
Nice.
Which is...
I get it.
So, now did you get through? Is that the...
No.
We still have a couple pages left.
Okay, I think, let's see.
Yeah.
Okay, we got 5 more minutes. You wanna...
Okay.
Who'd like to do next section?
You want to close it?
Who?
You?
Okay, sure. Yeah, fine.
Since The Hobbit.
Okay.
On the bottom.
Okay, we need a closer.
Be a closer. Finish it up.
ABC, always be closing if you want the steak knives.
There's a Lord of the Rings quote here, isn't there? Or at least from the movies that, finish it,
Finish him.
Mr. Frodo.
Is that supposed to be a pun?
Okay, so what was the last line? It was the Hobbit. Value of hobbits?
Do it, Mr.
At the
Frodo.
bottom of the page on the left, since
Make
the
an end
Hobbit,
of it.
Since the Hobbit.
You said on the left? I
On
thought it was on the right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Since The Hobbit was a success, a sequel was called for, and the remote elvish legends were turned down. A publisher's reader said they were too full of the kind of Celtic beauty that maddened Anglo-Saxons in a large dose. That's the Silmarillion. Very likely quite right. Anyway, I myself saw the value of hobbits in putting earth under the feet of romance and in providing subjects for ennoblement and heroes more praiseworthy than the professionals. Nolo heroizari is, of course, as good a start for a hero as nolo episcopari for a bishop. Can you break that translation down there? No? Okay. Not that I am a Democrat in any of its current uses, except that I suppose, to speak in literary terms, we are all equal before the great author, qui deposuit potentes de sede et exaltavit humiles.
We gave you the hardest part.
Here, I'm going to keep reading while you guys look up those references. All the same, I was not prepared to write a sequel in the sense of another children's story. I had been thinking about fairy stories and their relation to children. Some of the results I put into a lecture at St. Andrews and eventually enlarged and published an essay among those in the OEP as essays presented to Charles Williams and now most scurvily allowed to go out of print. As I expressed the view that the connection in the modern mind between children and fairy stories is false and accidental, and spoils the stories in themselves and for children, I wanted to try and write one that was not addressed to children at all as such. Also, I wanted a large canvas. A lot of labor was naturally involved, since I had to make a linkage with The Hobbit, but still more with the background mythology. That had to be rewritten as well. The Lord of the Rings is only the end part of a work nearly twice as long, which I worked at between 1936 and 53. I wanted to get it all published in chronological order, but that proved impossible. And the languages had to be attended to! ! If I had considered my own pleasure more than the stomachs of a possible audience, there would have been a great deal more Elvish in the book. But even the snatches that there are required, if they were to have a meaning, 2 organized phonologies and grammars and a large number of words. It would have been a big task without anything else, but I have been a moderately conscientious administrator and teacher, and I changed professorships in 1945, scrapping all my old lectures. And, of course, during the war, there was often no time for anything rational. I stuck for ages at the end of Book 3. Book 4 was written as a serial and sent out to my son serving in Africa in 1944. The last 2 books were written between 1944 and 48. That, of course, does not mean that the main idea of the story was a war product. That was arrived at in one of the earliest chapters still surviving, Book 1 and 2. It is really given, the present in germ, from the beginning, though I had no conscious notion of what the necromancer stood for, except ever-recurrent evil, in The Hobbit, nor of his connection with the ring. But if you wanted to go on from the end of The Hobbit, I think the ring would be your inevitable choice as the link. If then you wanted a large tale, the ring would at once acquire a capital letter, and the Dark Lord would immediately appear, as he did, unasked, on the heath at Bag End as soon as I came to that point. So the essential quest, capital Q, started at once. But I met a lot of things on the way that astonished me. Tom Bombadil I knew already, but I had never been to Bree. Strider sitting in the corner at the inn was a shock, and I had no more idea who he was than had Frodo.
Wow.
The mines of Moria had been a mere name, and of Lothlorien no word had reached my mortal ears till I came there. Far away I knew there were the horse lords on the confines of an ancient kingdom of men, but Fangorn Forest was an unforeseen adventure. I had never heard of the House of Eorl nor the Stewards of Gondor. Most disquieting of all, Saruman had never been revealed to me, and I was as mystified as Frodo at Gandalf's failure to appear on September 22nd. I knew nothing of the Palantiri, though the moment the Orthunk stone was cast from the window I recognized it, and knew the meaning of the rhyme of lore that had been running in my mind, 7 stars and 7 stones and 1 white tree. These rhymes and names will crop up, but they do not always explain themselves. I have yet to discover anything about the cats of Queen Beruthiel. But I did know more or less all about Gollum and his part, and Sam, and I knew that the way was guarded by a spider. And if that has anything to do with my being stung by a tarantula when a small child, people are welcomed to the notion, supposing the improbable that anyone is interested. I can only say that I remember nothing about it, should not know if I had not been told, and I do not dislike spiders particularly, and have no urge to kill them. I usually rescue those that I find in the bath.
Hey.
Well, now I'm really getting garrulous. I do hope you will not be frightfully bored. I hope also to see you again sometime, in which case we may perhaps talk about you and your work and not mine. Anyway, your interest in mine is a considerable encouragement. With very best wishes, yours sincerely, J.R.R. Tolkien.
We leave the spiders alone in the desert before they catch and kill
Sure,
all the
other stuff, yeah. Totally.
So why were Auden and Tolkien, if I may ask this, why were they good friends? Does anybody know?
I do not know.
Maybe we can pick up on that next time.
And I would say about childhood stories, so I kept having a memory, one of my earliest memories was of an incredible storm where the skies were really dark. Mm-hmm. And I was telling my mom about that many years later, and I'm like, I swear this is like a really early childhood memory. And she's like, did we ever live somewhere when I was little? Because I grew up in Santa Rosa, where the weather's wonderful, right? It's very fair and nice, Bay Area. And I was like, but I just remember this childhood, just really intense storm. And she's like, no, there's no way you'd remember that. My first 6 months we lived in Mississippi, and they were caught in a hurricane and stuff, and like a really intense storm. And and this was me asking, like, where did we live that there was this really, really intense storm? You never know what imprint gets left on an early especially childhood trauma. Experience, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, anything that's...
And so he's trying to discount the spider, and he doesn't have a phobia, so that's good. But you could certainly see like the imagery of
your
it.
Imagination.
Exactly. Like I don't have a fear of storms. I love storms. I think they're awesome. But that is my earliest memory. My next earliest being when I got burned by an iron when I was 10 months old. So I wonder about that. That's interesting.
That is interesting.
So, wow, covered a lot tonight.
We did.
Today. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam, for being here. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. That was I think we had a really meaty.
It's good to be back.
It is. It's good to be back. Indeed, it is. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, John. So thank you, Sam. Sam, would you be interested in? Do you think I should have you and my brother connect? Do you think that would be of interest? Some emails.
That'd be fun.
What's that?
That'd be fun.
Yes, that'd be fun.
Okay, great. Yeah, when it's on your head, we can't hear it very well. Okay.
Yeah, I know. I should know this. I teach online all the time. But
all right. Well, great. Well, thank you, Brian, for helping facilitate it as well. Thank you all for being here. Wherever you may be well, and Namarie. And we'll be back again, third Saturday of each month, 1 to 3 p.m., TolkienScholars.org.